In this video, I want to discuss the you and you problem. And maybe you can spot it in a couple of these statements. You create your own reality. You chose to be physical. You chose certain life lessons. You choose your physical body. You choose your beliefs. You drive a car. You choose what to have for lunch. You chose your parents for particular reasons. So let's look at this you and you problem. Now, let's start with you choosing your parents. Do you have a recollection, a memory? Have you ever had a memory of choosing your parents? So that's the first question. The second question is, there's a certain amount, or there's a continuum of traumatic abuse. So there's incest, there's physical violence, there's traumatic illiteracy, there's shaming. There's a whole host of traumatic events that happen in a majority of homes. And you take that with Lazaris' statement that you don't have to learn through pain. You don't have to learn through fear and fear of pain. You don't have to learn through shame. You could learn by having fun. So there's two steps that we are asked to go along with. And I say this because despite talking with numerous Lazaris friends and also a great number of other people, I've never met anyone who says, oh yes, I chose my parents. I was looking at, these options over here, and I chose my parents. And I was considering this one and this one and this one, and I chose this one. And I chose them for this and this reason. So I've never met that person. But I have met the person who drove their car and remembered choosing their car. So you can see there's two yous here in the Lazaris paradigm. There's one you that chooses to drive your car and chooses what books to read and chooses to some extent, when to leave home and, who to date and things like that. And that you remember. But who's the other you? Who's the you that Lazaris talks about with such confidence that you've never met? Who's that you? That's obviously a question. And the next question is, when there's one you that you remember, you understand, and you see to some degree of clarity. And there's another you according solely to Lazaris, right? Lazaris says, don't take our, don't just do things because we say so. We're not a teacher. We're not a guru. Work, do the things if they work for you. Do our techniques because they work, right? But we're obviously in a domain where certainly I can't say anything one way or another because I have no memory, no awareness of a me that's choosing this or that parent for this or that reason. So the problem is one of language. Now, if this is red and this is black, and I say this red, and I refer interchangeably between red and black as red. In other words, if there's a distinction in experience, this is hot, this is cold, this is a me that I know, this is a me supposedly. It's obviously not a me, because the me, see, me is the opposite, or it's the inverse of you. Lazaris uses you a tremendous amount. So for you to take on a you have to take on a me. And what is a me? What is an identity? An identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that the ego relates to, finds familiar, and identifies with. The I is the part of us that associates itself with the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being in physical known memory. So when I say me, I'm referring to the pattern that I remember of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Now, let's say that I sleepwalk. I don't call that me unless I'm aware of it, because let's say I do all kinds of things in my sleep. I go happily to sleep at whatever time of night. I wake up right where I was in my bed, but it turns out that some other form of consciousness enters my body. Well, you could call it channeling. Is Jach Lazaris? Is Lazaris Jach? So Jach, the identity, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that Jach says is me, goes to sleep. And then another pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that calls itself Lazaris moves the body. Now you could say that's another part of Jach. That's you and that's you. And we could actually refer to that interchangeably. We could say, Jach, when you said this, and then Jach, when you said this, and Jach could say, well, I didn't say that. You could say, yeah, here it is. Here it is on the tape. This is you saying it. And Jach saying, no, that's not me. That's Lazaris. That's another me. So why is that distinction useful? It's useful because when we say the word me, it's useful to reference that which we are aware of and that which we associate with our body versus that which we are not aware of and do not associate with our body. I don't say that I was born and raised in Russia. Now, I could say, because Lazaris actually uses 3 U's. He says, you, that is here today, and thank you for coming, and and wishing you and talking to you, and he says you. Then he talks about you that picked this lifetime or picked being physical, and you that chose this life and chose this parent and chose this and chose that. Then he talks about you, the shadow that has payoffs and does this, light and dark. Then he talks about the many yous, referencing the world at large, the many yous. So now we've got 3 yous. We've got all these other people, which in another session are all illusions, right? They don't really exist unless you make them real. But so all those illusionary parts of you that don't exist unless you make them real, and then those parts of you exist. And then you have the you that was choosing the lifetime, and then you have the you that you actually think of as you. Now, these are three very distinct identities. You know, I could look at you and say you're one of the many me's out there, but it's more useful in kind of being aware of the differences between us to call you you and me. So the mystery is, what's Lazaris up to by saying the many yous as one category of you, the you that designed and organized the lifetime, and the you that's in the lifetime? It seems to me that calling those three things different things, for example, if we say that there is a part of consciousness that is aware and has influence on the lifetime, and then there's the you, that is your ego, that is in the lifetime, and there's a connection between that the one you can see but you don't see. Why? Because the you that you don't see chose to forget. I mean, if there's any choice at all, if they didn't choose to forget, if they just forget, then it's not necessarily useful to say you chose to forget. And then it's also useful to say, you know, you're you watching this video and this is me, and distinguish that by name, right? Rather than just say you, and you know, you said this and you said this and you said this, and none of it necessarily agrees, but it's all you. It's more useful to say Michael says this and Philip says that and Dane says this. But there is, you could say that you are each part of a probability field that is human. So to the degree that there is a human identity, you are each expressions or facets or faces of that probability field, that is humanity. And so you are part of that larger probability field of all that is human, but you are not aware of what every other human being is doing. You're aware of what you're doing. So these are really important boundaries to keep distinct. And one of the reasons is, you know, another thread that Lazaris suggested in the shame material, that one way to shame someone or be shamed is to demand something that they are incapable of doing. I think Lazaris referenced, you know, having sex with a 5-year-old as being shaming, because you're asking or demanding of a 5-year-old something they cannot do. They can't be an equal lover with an adult, or, you know, asking someone with no construction experience to design a bridge, or asking someone with no nuclear physics experience to pick whether to press this button or this button. And if you press this button, there will be a nuclear bomb. And if you press this button, the plant's cooling system will turn on and the disaster will be averted. And giving it to someone who knows nothing about the protocols and design and saying, here, solve the problem. Let's save us from nuclear holocaust. Please press one of the buttons. Do it. That this is shaming, that this is traumatic, because you're asking an identity, a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, that is incompetent. It lacks the knowledge to be successful in that domain. You're asking that identity, that pattern, to make decisions that they have no basis to make, you know. handed a chart of metals and saying there's one of these steels, according to the engineer, that this skyscraper can withstand a 100-year earthquake. None of the other steels will work. There's one steel, and if you pick the right one, then 50,000 lives will be saved in the next 100 years. If you pick the wrong one, they'll all die, and it'll be your fault. Quick, pick this steel. There's 200 varieties of steel. Tell us which one. We've got to get this frame up. So, okay, this one, right? And then why did you kill all those people, right? So to ask someone to do something they cannot do, to tell a 5-year-old to carry a 1-ton bar of steel, and then why aren't you coming? Come on, I'm waiting, right? That this is shaming. Psychological shaming, physical shaming, sexual shaming. And yet, isn't that what Lazaris does when he asks the ego identity? Now, it's all very well to say, well, we're much more than the ego. But who's much more than the ego? Meaning, if I have zero memory before birth, to say you're bigger than birth is simply inaccurate. The pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, other than those thoughts injected by Lazaris, begin around age 2, falling in tall grasses as the family dog chased me through the grass. Those are the first memories of an identity, a me that attaches to the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being chased through grasses and knocked over by the family dog. That's as far as my recollection, my awareness goes. So who's the you that's before that? Now, in hypnosis, memory can be expanded dramatically. And I have heard of stories where, in reincarnation, I've read a book about reincarnation where certain children remember certain events or are aware of certain events that seem to have taken place before they were born. And so there is, currently maybe 1/1,000,000th. So of the documented cases, maybe 1 in a million people, let's say there's 1,000 of those records around in various books and others, or maybe 10,000. There's 7 billion people. So, there's a certain amount of people that have an awareness that is transcending the birth. It's going outside of that bound. Now again, we don't know if that is a psychic transcendence, meaning someone in the past, some identity, a pattern of thought, feeling, speaking, and doing in the past, projected that energy out, and then someone later received that energy and identified with it. That's what identity is. It's a part that attaches to the pattern and says, this is me. If you don't attach to the pattern and you just witness it, you just say, I see a picture of someone living this life. If you don't identify with your own thoughts and feelings, it's called Buddhism. You witness, but you don't attach. You just say, those are thoughts moving around. I neither stop them or this, or claim them or this. Those are just thoughts moving through, and those are feelings moving through. So the sense of you gets more fluid, dissolves more. And then you witness someone else doing this, and you witness you doing this, and there's no particular identification. So the first problem that I see is one of language, which is there are different patterns of energy being referenced. You, the many yous, the this, that, different patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being in different locations in space-time being referenced, but all under the same name, you, and you. That's a language problem. In the same way that if I say, green, 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 and green, there's a language problem because, this is darker brown, this is lighter brown, this is darker black, this is green, this is a darker thing. If we call all of this green, we don't see more clearly. The distinctions become fuzzy. So that's what language does, is it cuts up distinctions into bits that are crude approximations to tell us this is different from this. And so that's the first problem. The second problem is, just, one of being told things. Admittedly, there's a trust rapport that's built up with Lazaris for many Lazaris friends. But even with your husband and wife, if I tell you as my spouse, you chose to be born because of this and this and this, and you have no memory, it creates an imbalance of power, an imbalance of influence. Like, we're not telling Lazaris, you chose to channel through this for this and this and this reason, and you had, all the people that left, you left being actively involved with you. You did that for this reason and this reason. So you came in and you got more and more popular, and then many of the people that worked with you went off for other reasons, and you did that, Lazaris, because you had this lesson to learn, or this and that and the other. And Lazaris would say, well, gee, I have no awareness of that. But thanks for telling me, or whatever. It's problematic. You chose to be married to me because you wanted someone with a firm hand to tell you the way things were, and to do this and do this. So I don't recall doing any of that. Well, you did. That's, I see clearly, and I chose to marry you because, I have things to teach you, or whatever. This is a murky terrain. It's not generally going to lead in a good direction to tell other people why they're doing things that they have not thought about and cannot remember. So that's the next problem, is, what do you do with that? You chose to have parents that abuse you. Why? Well, Lazaris said in my one personal reading that I wanted to work with loneliness very specifically. So why? Why did I want to work with loneliness very specifically? See, it all has to reference Lazaris, because if I never would have come up with that, and I haven't come up with that in 47 years. There hasn't been one dream, one meditation, one thing where it's like, I get it. This is why I, the bigger me, thinks having abusive parents to learn about loneliness is a terrific plan. I'm so glad I figured it out, and I've been, working with loneliness. I've never had that, not once, not an inkling. I just have a recording of a channeled entity telling me that that's what life is about because you chose it. Well, at what point does that become shaming to, you're drowning in a river, and it's because it's not because nobody's helping you or there was a flood or whatever. It's because you chose to have an experience drowning and nobody helping you. And so, and God gives you all that you want. And if you wanted to be saved, and you wouldn't have drowned, and that's just the way it is, Die a horrible death. At what point does asking the identity, the one that says this is me, because I remember it and I have an awareness of that, and that's consistent with the habits that I've either developed or witnessed in myself. Asking that self, which is all that we have, to be responsible, to respond to something where there is no memory. At what point is that shaming within Lazaris's framework? Now, at what point is it crazy making within ours? To say, I chose this before I was born. Really? Why do you do that? Well, I don't know. I don't actually have any memory of choosing that or any knowledge about it, but that's what this channeled entity said. Well, who's that channeled entity? Well, he's not a teacher or a guru, but he knows all these things. And if you sign up for a session or whatever, then he'll tell you all these things that you don't know, and that it's really you. So, what do you do with that, right? So that's a problem. But the fourth problem comes in when you overlay that with, okay, so that's a you that's choosing to suffer, and so here you are suffering. But they didn't have to. In other words, you chose to have a lifetime of suffering, but you could have chosen a lifetime of fun and joy, and it would have been easier to have chosen a lifetime of fun and joy. It's much easier to succeed than it is to fail. You could have done that, but you didn't. You chose to learn through pain and fear, but you didn't have to. So you have kind of this thing, well, you chose the lifetime, and almost everyone made a mistake, right? I've yet to meet the Lazaris friend that hasn't had all kinds of frustrating, enraging, disappointing, shaming, whatever. We're not talking about a higher and higher states of fun type of community. I don't see it. I haven't met them. I don't experience it, right? So Lazaris is in one kind of breath saying, you're doing all this, and it's a mistake, and you're working harder to cause yourself pain than you would have to just enjoy life. But it's you doing that, and you didn't have to, but you're doing it, and so that's why you're suffering. And it's up to you to figure out how to change that using our techniques. Well, then you have another layer of frustration and crazy making and shame because, of course, 95% of the time, the mists of manifestation, the 33-second technique, the processing and programming does not stop the traumatic memory, does not end shame, does not end pain, does not lead to more abundance than you could possibly imagine, does not lead to, enlightenment, whatever it is. It leads to Lazaris saying the techniques work, and that if they don't work, you didn't want them to. Now, again, we're talking about which you. Like, do you recall saying, hey, I don't want these techniques to work. Let's do these techniques and make sure they don't work so that we can continue to be miserable. See, that's another one of those yous. I don't recall that being my first response. That wasn't kind of, oh yes, I'm going to do this so that I can do this. So that's one of those other yous. So the you that is before birth is messing up your life by giving you all kinds of difficulties that they didn't have to. So they're fucked up in a sense, right? So there's a me that could have done it wonderfully, but did a bad job. And then here's a me that could be doing it wonderfully, but is doing a bad job as well. And there's a Lazaris that's doing it perfectly, but both this me and this me aren't doing it good enough to receive the endless gift that is Lazaris. So there's no, so now this doesn't go over very well in a marriage either. I'm just trying to love you and I'm doing it perfectly and everything's great, but you aren't doing it well. And then you've got another you that decided before birth not to do it well. And so it's up to this you to work with this part that isn't doing a good job and then go back to the birth part so that you can enjoy our marriage, which I'm doing perfectly. Loving you more than you can possibly imagine. Well, this doesn't lead to sustainable marriages. This leads to therapists saying, a little bit too much narcissism, not enough responsibility. Because Lazaris would tell you to own what your partner is doing. But Lazaris doesn't seem to tell themselves to own what we're doing in partnership with Lazaris. Like, look at your partner as a reflection of your disowned shadow. But we're not going to look at you as a reflection of our disowned shadow. Like, we can't get around the fact that our techniques are not working 90% of the time to do the results that 90% of the people want 90% of the time. And, after a few decades of being around Lazaris friends, doing all kinds of things and repeating the same patterns, whether it's in relationship or money or whatever it is, and then repeating the pattern of shaming themselves for not, being a big enough dreamer or whatever it is, not getting it to work, but never saying, hey, Lazaris, what about your payoffs for having a paid friendship with people feeling inadequate most of the time? Do you have a payoff for that, or what is it? There's no, and this is also, very normal in power differentials. If one person has all the money and all the social rank and all the competence, and the other person is afraid that they're going to fall apart basically and doesn't have any money and doesn't have any social standing and doesn't have any backup plans, then you will find, if you watch in any psychological relationship, that the one that feels powerless will blame themselves and apologize for the problems that they bring to the relationship, but also the problems that the abuser or their partner brings to the relationship. So, my wife grew up in a very abusive family, severe physical and psychological and sexual abuse. And because her parents beat her for trying to give them any accountability whatsoever, or to treat her better, that was their response, she turned that towards herself. So one of her favorite defenses is to say it's all my fault, and then to beat herself up. So if I point out, hey, you said you would do this, why aren't you doing this? She's not going to say, well, the reason I'm not doing that is because you also told me to do this, and I can't do two things at once. If it's the abuse talking, she's going to say, it's all my fault, and wait to be hit, because that's the learned behavior of trauma. Now, of course, I could shame her and say, well, you must have had important life lessons to learn, because of this and this. But that's not good psychological advice. It's not what the best therapists and healers that get results do. So I do the opposite of what Lazaris says. I say, wait a minute, let's pause here. This is not a global issue, first of all. This is just you didn't do this one thing that you said you were going to do, and it's causing problems. So let's stay there. Secondly, this whole collapse, it's all my fault, that's bullshit. I'm a completely engaged partner in this dynamic. I probably did, tell you to do this and then do this. But why didn't you tell me? You've told me two different things so that we can then discuss it, because maybe I forgot or whatever. But you're not the cause of everything wrong in our marriage. You see, I'm not talking to her about creating her own reality. I'm saying, no, you don't create it all. You're not responsible for your fucked up parents. You're not responsible for your fucked up cult. You're not responsible for your fucked up priest. You're not responsible for the poverty in the Philippines. You're not responsible for any of that. And I'm responsible for none of that, but for choosing you as a partner. And I'm also responsible for the things that make it harder for you, as well as the things that make it easier. But I'm not responsible for all of the things that make that so hard for you. In other words, I'm helping her, and one of my biggest positive impacts on her have been to segment responsiveness, to lift the shame of being blamed, punished, traumatized, and hated for anything that went wrong, in her country, in her neighborhood, of other people's behavior, and in her family. So that's consistent with psychological research, but it's not consistent with Lazaris. And so I would never apply that. Now, this also brings in, what works. Do what works, right? All beliefs are true, pick the ones that work. Well, having spent 1,000 hours studying traumatic literature, what works is making these distinctions. Also, some numbers of distinctions. I'm angry about this, but I'm not angry that I married you. This is a mistake, but you are not a mistake. You are responsible for choosing not to make notes of things, knowing that you're forgetful, you could sit down and make a note, but you're lazy. You don't want to do that, right? And you are responsible for that. You know you forget things, so make a note. You are responsible for that. You could do that, and when you do it, it works, and when you don't, it doesn't work. So that's a choice point. You've got some influence there. But I understand that being asked to carry the entire family system from birth, you feel burdened and overloaded with demands and stuff. And so you would like to not take on any more than is absolutely required. And I want you to take this on so that we have a more balanced relationship. And I get that it's not your ideal, right? You'd just as soon go off in a fantasy world. And you can, if you want to go marry somebody else or do this, go right ahead. I'm by no means perfect. So you could do that at any point, and I will support you. But if you want to be married to me, you have to do this. I am annoyed when you don't keep your commitments, because I keep my commitments to you every single time. And you don't have to nag me. I don't want to have to nag you, right? So these are partitions, boundaries. You are not responsible for your fucked up parents. It's not your fault. The traumatic feelings that are so entrenched in your body, they are expected. They're predicted if someone treats you the way you've been treated. And they're not easy to break out, meaning it doesn't matter if you go to Lazaris workshops and spend $100,000. It doesn't matter if you do this and this and this. There's a lot of people stuck in those patterns, and they feel horrible. And, you do go to this therapist and this therapist and this therapist, and it's not working. Now, you can say because you have payoffs and, because you want to suffer and punish, make sure everyone's being punished. And you can say that. Lazaris isn't a teacher and a guru, but they just presume to teach and behave very much like a guru, which is a bit crazy making. But, you can do that. It's just not helpful a lot of the time. It produces anxiety. How am I doing this that I can't be aware? It produces fear. It produces depression. I keep trying and I'm not getting better in this. And Lazaris just carries on talking about the new world and the new thing. Lazaris doesn't stop and say, hey, some of our people are depressed. Let's spend a whole weekend helping and learning with that. No, Lazaris goes on to talk about Lemuria or whatever, and those are things that Lazaris chooses, to do that versus not to do that. Those are things. So there's a shame issue. There's a distinction issue. There's a working issue. There's a crazy-making issue. So if neither you, meaning if you, the ego, could live happily ever after, but are working very, very hard to not live happily ever after for all kinds of, and there's 20 years of reasons for this, because first it was this, and then it was this, because all things come down to self-importance and self-pity. All things, all negativity is self-importance and self-pity. So heaven help you that you're crying in the corner after being beaten and raped throughout your childhood. Poor you. No, don't do that, and don't think you're special. And who needs that? But it's all about self-pity and self-importance. But then it's all about pain. Pain is the seed. You can end pain. And then it's all about your payoffs. And then it's all because on the causal plane you didn't want it, right? If you didn't do this, and then it's all because you're not doing the 33-second technique, because could give you could do the 33-second technique and your whole body could just shift and change, and suddenly crooked limbs would be straight, and because you wanted it, and there it was, and the whole reality shifted. It's all there. Really, it's all starting from a lot of different places. You know, your scripts, it's all about your beliefs. It's all about your expectations, your desires, things. It's all about this. And, you know, and there isn't a correlation with impact to really say, okay, well, how many people are getting what results out of any of this or this or this? So that's a bit of a problem as well, because then you think, if you are a novice in the community, you think that there are other people who they chose to have great parents, and then they chose to learn through joy and love rather than pain and fear. And then they're creating an abundance elegantly, and are doing this, and you think that, and then you think, well, gee, you know, the part of me that I have no idea about screwing up my life, then the part of me that I know is apparently not doing it good enough. And Lazaris' techniques work, but they don't work with me. And I better not say I'm in self-pity, because I wouldn't want to be that. And wouldn't want to, and so now the spiritual critic grows, because no one I know is doing any of these, 40 years of techniques, right? They're all recommending them. Why don't you listen to this tape? Or why don't you listen to that tape? But I've never met, and then when you learn that that's not Penny and Jach either, that Penny and Jach have just as many problems as anyone else, and in many cases more than certain other people who have never heard of Lazaris, then what's that about, right? You can't ask that, because then you get banished from speaking about it. So, we have layer upon layer upon layer of potential problem here. And the question is how to sort it out. It's well, that's what this is, how to sort that out. And for me, I just let it be okay that Lazaris is not the best source of information or of competence or of techniques for any number of areas. I mean, there are any number of areas where just some average human helped me more. I saw a shift in my reality. I felt different after talking about this and this. And a lot of that is just the common sense that when you have a dialogue rather than a monologue, you can work through more things. When Lazaris has spent so much time saying, you know this, you know that, you did this, you did that, this is how it is, and so little time asking what people's experiences are, that it's, you have to go through all of that projection in order to say, well, this is my reality. And then, when Lazaris says that they're the greatest being to ever touch the planet, which sounds pretty guru-like, but also says they're not a guru, and you can just let it, let Lazaris be imperfect. Let it, I'm not going to take any of that on. In the areas where Lazaris is a powerful friend and resource, or, it supports me to feel sustainably better. I may or may not call it a friendship, because friends don't usually have to pay one another to be friends. But a teacher, an inspirer, whatever you call it, a guru, a resource, a business, whatever, that brings my quality of life up in this area. And that seems to be one of the healthier dynamics. In general, I've found that the people at the center of a self-referential group or dogma or philosophy or school of any time are usually the sickest. And the people out at the edge are the healthiest. Meaning if you're at the center of the Findhorn power structure, you're more likely to be sick than if you're someone coming and taking a workshop at Findhorn. If you've never explored Lazaris before in your life and you listen to a tape or whatever and, oh, that's interesting and stuff, you're more likely to be uplifted than if you're, working 2 or 3 hours a day at Lazaris and working for concept synergy and all of this. That I think deals with toxicity in the dose. Everything is toxic in very high concentrated doses, and everything is medicinal in doses that balance the imbalances, whatever they may be, right? So in some context, everything is medicinal. And I would even say that, in some context, what Lazaris is saying, that there's a bigger you and there's, many more things about you that you don't understand, that can be medicinal for some people in some doses. And it is definitely a scientific fact that all energy is connected. I mean, you can connect a fingernail with the gravitational pull on Mars. You can connect thoughts with a fingernail. You can connect words and thoughts. You can connect a thought with the Pleiades. You just think of it, right? And so there are many, many ways in which energy is all connected. But the real challenge and the real question, I think, for all of us is, what is the way that we can relate with our ecology, with the parts that we are aware of, and with others in our life, so as to create the most amount of sustainable well-being and the least amount of chronic and unnecessary suffering. And by and large, as we learn those ways, we take them. By and large. When we can do so with mastery and with awareness, we're very frightened of the unknown, and we're frightened of death because of that unknown. We're frightened of the unknown because we're afraid of being out of control. We're afraid of being out of control because the last time we were utterly and completely out of control in infancy, we experienced profound helplessness, loneliness, traumatic abuse. And having established control, we don't want to go back to helpless, abusive dependency. And so control is our remedy for that helplessness. And strategy and paranoia is, I want to explore and see the threats in my mind before I live them, right? If I look down a dark alley and see shapes moving there and I've seen some crime, I want to say, there is a very, very small chance, so maybe a 0.5% chance that if I go down this alley at 3 a.m, I'll be raped or mugged or shot. And it's an unpleasant thought, but I prefer to know that that's a slight probability and to go the other way than to be peaceful and happy, right? To say, it's wonderful, let's go down the alley, see what those moving figures are huddling over by, that fire. And then experience that probability as a dense physical form, right? And here we also have another paradox that I haven't gotten to in this kind of series of paradoxes and confusions, which is Lazaris says that whatever has the most attention becomes the strongest and lives the longest. You can look that up on one of the tapes. I think it's Healing the Scars of the Past. So, he doesn't go into that, he just says that, right? So what would that suggest? Well, it would suggest that, you don't think about the thought of being mugged in an alley, because then that pattern of energy gets stronger. He said, whatever has form seeks to perpetuate itself. Everything that has a form seeks to perpetuate itself. And whatever has the most attention lives the longest and is the strongest. So how do you respond? Well, you saw Neville Chamberlain ignore Hitler's sociopathic tendencies. Oh, it's just a few this, it's no big deal. No, the Germans aren't committing those atrocities. Let's just get on. Let's not arm. Right? So the whole policy of appeasement with Adolf Hitler was to ignore the sociopathic tendencies in Adolf Hitler and not give it any attention. The American president called up and said, this is a dictator. Well, that's just the American president, right? It's not the British world power, right? So you ignore the sociopathic tendencies. You ignore Mein Kampf. But it gets stronger and lives longer. Adolf Hitler, rather than being assassinated or taken out of office because of being confronted by the world early on, his generals were ready to do that, instead lived longer because he was allowed. So how does that fit into the story, right? So we're turning a blind eye, and the incest continues. So you don't want to focus on the incest and do something about it because, then it'll grow bigger. So what do you make of that? Concept synergy has not cleaned up its act because everyone agreed not to mention how incompetent it was. No, to the degree that concept synergy is doing some things to clean up its act, are largely a response to pointing it out, to, hey, this is what's going on. Let's call a spade a spade. Now, you also have Lazaris's disproportionate focus on, if you look at the portrait of that Lazaris paints of his friends, of people, throughout the tape, you get a very clear picture of hypocrisy, of payoffs, of cruelty, of sociopathic behavior, of this, of that. Lazaris is constantly using examples of corruption and this and that and misunderstanding and confusion, etc. And so, Lazaris could just talk about us as luminous beings so that those identity forms of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing that are about, lust and greed and whatever it is, don't get mentioned. But instead, Lazaris says, work with the shadow, bring it to consciousness. But whatever you give attention becomes the strongest and lives the longest. So what's which one is it, right? Look and do the negative, look at the negative things, or don't look at the negative things, right? So that's what's on my mind today. And, I think the healthiest thing, to the degree that Lazaris is responsible, able and willing to respond, I think the healthiest thing is for Lazaris to respond to whatever degree they want to, and for individuals to respond, with thinking. I'm glad Lazaris has encouraged thinking deeper and pointed out the crisis of people not being willing to think things through, and how that's a fertile bed for ego and fear to grow. That you have to be willing to think and, assert. And in an environment where concept synergy is intolerant in the extreme of this type of thing, I think it takes a certain amount of courage, a certain amount of willingness. I mean, because there's no particular map. What exactly do you do when the publishing company and channel are paranoid and trying to control all critical thought and won't respond, and the channeled entity is talking about responsibility and this and that and the other? What do you do in that situation, right? So I think figuring out what we do. I mean, my choice is simply to think all these things through out loud and continually to do that, as things occur in my mind, to keep doing that and to create the space for people to say whatever they want, critically or supportively in response, and to think things through themselves. But to the extent that one believes that Lazaris is a very significant source of data and information, I think is to the source that one would want, and it's important to address both criticisms and possible or probable problems in the terrain, and figure out how one forms one's own relationship. And I find the easiest thing is just to let go of any attachment to Lazaris's statement that they're the highest resonance for all time, because that would suggest that they can't make any mistakes, or that there isn't a better way of doing things. And clearly, there are many better ways of doing things in many situations for various people. And it doesn't make sense to me that the highest resonance of all time could not manage to get that across better when I could. I mean, and I'm filled with imperfections and, all kinds of toxicities, etc. So if this can be easily articulated by me, I would expect that, a higher resonance or whatever, with more intelligence and access to more data and clarity would do a better job of addressing all these points than me, and would welcome it. Many great leaders love criticism and want to use that as a point to grow. So that's it.